What's going on, guys? Mr. Normal here, and yes, I sleep like this. Salutations, fellow tubers. Today's episode is about death. Why? Well, Darksiders 2 recently came out, and given the obvious subject matter of the game, I thought, hey, it's appropriate. And there are hardly any other times to talk about it without sounding so cliché. And talking about death isn't something normally brought up in a conversation without the expected rolling of the eyes. The concept of death seems both mundane and exotic at the same time that when discussed, no one really has a good bearing on how exactly to respond. Be honest, imagine someone coming up to you at a party and they wanted to talk about death. Saying that would be a mood killer is an understatement. So exactly how does one even come about talking about death in the first place without, engaging in some sophomoric conversation while drinking with goths? Is it even possible? Well, the answer to that question is yes, it is possible. And when do you talk about it? Well, after the release of Darksiders 2. The fact that you play as none other than the Reaper himself, it seems inevitable, or at least I would imagine the conversation would be inevitable. I mean, how do you go 20 plus hours playing as death without actually thinking about death itself? About how we, as human beings, are, as the philosopher Martin Heidegger said, engaged in being towards death. How is it that something which is clearly manifested as as a scythe-wielding badass in the game, in reality, is a force, if you could call it that. It's a force which cultures have grappled with in diverse ways, in very, very different ways as well. Now, I need to quickly note that this video, as you can already probably tell, is not a Darksiders 2 video. I'm not intending to do that, so if you're here expecting Darksiders 2 material, you won't find it save a few glimpses of the game. I just thought the topic of death was relevant given the game's recent release. Now, really onto our topic. I want to pose the question to you guys, and the details will be made clear soon, so I'll leave you guys in mystery at first. But the question is, how should death be portrayed in video games? So I'll repeat that. How should death be portrayed in video games? Are there better portrayals than others? Now the question is obviously vague for now, because what exactly do I mean by this? Do I mean how should video games portray a character of death in the way Darksiders 2 did? Or do I mean something more akin to the concept of death itself? Part of the reason why the question is so vague is because the word itself, death, is itself ambiguous and lends itself to many meanings. Because of this, there's room for a host of interpretations of it. So I'd like, in an attempt to clarify the question, I want to start out by giving some general observations of the different meanings of death. And I'll only chart two of those things. So, in some cultures, death is seen as a process, something which manifests itself during our lifetime. So in this sense, we are dying. Death is what pervades our lives. In other words, it's like a slowly decaying system. Death is simply the process which slowly extinguishes the functionality of a system we have recognized as quote-unquote living. Death also has another meaning, and it seems to be the implicit meaning when we use death in everyday conversation, and that is death as a sudden event. Someone is driving down the road, and then he or she gets hit by a drunk driver. They were once alive, now they're dead. So death in this context designates an event which happens at some given time. We often think of fairy tales that talk of witches or something of the sort that reveal to curious individuals of the time and place of their death. So again, in this view, death is something that will happen, but has not yet happened. So just to rephrase all this, in the first interpretation of the phenomenon of death, death is something happening concurrently with life. Death is something, in a sense, that makes life possible. In the second view, death is something apart from life. It is life's opposite. Now, I bring up these two conceptions of death not to just give you some random food for thought. There actually is a reason. Soon after E3 2012, which seems like eons ago, a GameSpot article by Tom McShea turned a few heads. The article was called "When Did Regenerating Health Become Realistic?" The link is actually in the description if you want to read the article for yourself. The article, in short, is Tom McShea's response to Medal of Honor Warfighter's purported authenticity pitch. The article is also an attempt at giving a legitimate argument that states that regenerating health equals a trivialization of death in the military. So I actually have a quote here from him, and the quote is, "Developers continually talk about how much respect they have for real-life soldiers, but you'd be hard-pressed to find evidence of that claim in their games. Warfighter is just joining a growing list of games that include Battlefield, Call of Duty, Homefront, and too many more to list. Getting shot at hardly matters in these games. The only hint that you've been wounded is a slightly obscured view, but that hardly communicates the horrible pain and life-threatening conditions." End quote. Now, what we have here is an individual, this is Tom McShea, who is upset by how death is dealt with in a game. The article is chock full of moralizing about how we are supposed to portray death, or dying in this context. It's going to be the evils of war. But a question arises: what conception of death is McShea working with? Which conception, the first one I outlined earlier, or the second one? Which one is operational in his moralizing? It seems he is working with the second conception of death, the one that sees death as an event, something to be avoided altogether, death as the opposite of life. He is upset in the first-person shooters that in first-person shooters people's lives are not easily ended by a bullet, or as he wishes to remind us so condescendingly, quote, "Soldiers cannot in fact take multiple bullets to the back, shrug them off like they're mosquito bites, kill whoever had the gall to fire in the first place, and then return to 100% health." End quote. So, with that, clearly McShea sees Medal of Honor Warfighter as not respecting the soldiers by not portraying death in the way he wants death to be portrayed. In other words, because Medal of Honor does not lend itself to the sort of consequentialist take on death which is operational in his own thinking, McShea concludes that there is something wrong. That is, it somehow trivializes death. Now, what do we make of this? Well, McShea is partly right. Partly. It does trivialize death, but note, it trivializes his conception of how he thinks death ought to be conceived. So another question then arises: what sort of conception of death does Medal of Honor work with? Now, I can't say much for other Medal of Honor titles, but in Warfighter, the introduction of the fire team system, where you and a buddy work together, spawning on each other, covering one another, and even avenging one another, with this system, death is not conceived of in the way McShea sees it. Instead, it's more akin to the first conception of death that I outlined earlier, and that is death as a part of a living system bound by entropy. In this view, we're not living to die in the end. Instead, we're dying to live. The very act or process of living requires a constant decay. Death is then a process which guides living, or at least is always happening. In Medal of Honor Warfighter, when your buddy is killed, you suddenly use his death as a means of moving forward in the game. For those of you who don't know, a red outline actually appears around your buddy's killer, and this acts as information to achieve a given goal. So death, in these instances, is not being trivialized when looked upon in this way. In fact, it seems to be closer to what soldiers actually say when asked what keeps them going to battle. Most soldiers answer, "I'd fight for the soldier next to me." By putting emphasis on your team member's killer allows us to empathize with soldiers in a more fluid way. Now, in a wonderful book called How to Do Things with Video Games, Ian Bogost, I probably butchered the name, so I'll just call him Ian from now on, but Ian writes about video games' capacity to put us in the shoes of a character. However, Ian argues that most games put us in power roles, where we wield magic powers to overcome some obstacle or something of the sort. Rarely, if ever, do games put us in powerless roles. In one chapter, he does argue that more games need to emphasize powerless roles as to better, how do I say this? As to better enhance empathic experience, so our ability to feel empathy. Because only by making it easier for us to empathize with the character are we going to truly come to a better understanding. Ian mentions indie games like Darfur is Dying, in which you're trying to survive against the Janjaweed. But in this game, you're powerless. You're just trying to get to a well so you can drink some water. But in the process, you have to hide. So a video game's ability to invoke empathy plays a serious role in whether or not we come to see the game as authentic. Now, going back to McShea's article, he seems to be under the notion that Medal of Honor has done something that makes it not authentic. But what's missing is not an ability to empathize, because it clearly does with the fireteam aspect, but instead what makes it unauthentic is some game mechanic, and that is health regeneration. So the question becomes, to respect death or to portray death appropriately in a game, what is more important? Is it some added game mechanic that reveals a development team's respect or disrespect for death, or is it the game's capacity to produce empathy in gamers? Now, my own opinion is that empathy is what matters. There could be a first-person shooter in which I'm invincible, it wouldn't matter. And as long as the game succeeds in allowing me to experience empathy for a character, then whatever, it's fine. It takes much more for a game to disrespect some phenomenon in reality like death by merely adding a specific game mechanic. What matters is the overall experience. Do the game mechanics, when combined, generate the capacity for empathy? If yes, then it's authentic. So with that said, I'm back at the original question posed at the beginning. How should death be portrayed in video games? Does it matter? If a game makes light of one conception of death, does this mean it has done something wrong? Perhaps games can portray death in different ways, and there isn't one single way of portraying death which is the right one. A follow-up question. Do you think games influence our ways of thinking about death, or are games merely representing death in a way that is already prevalent in our culture? Well, I'll leave you with that, and so thank you for listening to this nearly 12-minute video. I'm Mr. Normal. Unpleasant thoughts.